If you haven't seen part 1, click the link above or follow the link in the description. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The game began quietly, as though it was nothing more than a simple charade. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she reluctantly joined the children in the dimly lit basement. The eerie silence seemed to press down on her, heavy and suffocating. The two children stood before her, their eyes locked onto hers, devoid of emotion. They weren't acting like children at all. They were mechanical, like puppets. And Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something. "Come, Sarah," Mrs. Jenkins' voice echoed from above. "The game will help you understand your place here." Sarah swallowed hard, trying to ignore the sharpness of her fear. She glanced around the room, looking for an escape, but the walls felt like they were closing in. The basement was too cold, too quiet, and the only sound was the soft stuff of feet against the concrete floor. One of the children, a boy with pale blue eyes, stepped forward and handed Sarah a small, worn-out doll. The doll's porcelain face was cracked, its features contorted into an unnatural smile. It looked wrong, like it had been forced into a shape that it wasn't meant to hold. Sarah hesitated but took the doll, unsure of what else to do. She didn't want to play, but she had no choice. "You have to join them." Mrs. Jenkins' voice came again, now echoing from the far corner of the room. Though the woman wasn't anywhere to be seen, "They need someone who understands the rules. And the rules are simple, Sarah. Play or suffer the consequences." Fear clawed at Sarah's insides, but she clung to the doll, trying to steady her breath. She watched as the children, now holding their own dolls, began to slowly move toward the back of the room. In the far corner was a large, old wooden chest, its lid partially open. The children stopped in front of it, and for a moment, Sarah thought they were simply going to play with the dolls like any child would. But then they began to stack them, one by one, inside the chest. Her heart began to race as she realized what they were doing. The dolls weren't for play, they were being stored, hidden away. And there was something wrong about the way the children were acting. Their movements were stiff, deliberate, as though they were performing a ritual rather than playing a game. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. But the children didn't answer. They simply continued stacking the dolls inside the chest. A deep sense of dread settled over her, and she turned toward the door, her fingers fumbling for the handle. But it was locked. She was trapped. She spun around to face the children, her fear turning into a surge of panic. "Let me out. What are you doing? What is this?" The boy with the pale blue eyes looked at her for the first time, his expression empty, and in that moment, Sarah saw that there was something wrong with the doll in his hands. It wasn't just a toy. It was a human finger, a severed, mutilated finger that had been sewn onto the doll's body. Her breath caught in her throat, the blood drained from her face, and she stumbled back. No, this can't be real," she whispered. But deep down, she knew it was. The children weren't playing. They were preserving the remains of the missing children. And worse still, they were doing it under Mrs. Jenkins' command. The room seemed to spin, and Sarah's thoughts were drowned by the mounting terror. She needed to leave. She had to get Timmy and escape before it was too late. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Mrs. Jenkins was involved in something much darker than she had ever imagined. And now Sarah was tangled in it too. Frantically, Sarah pulled at the door again, her fingers slick with sweat as she struggled to open it. But then she heard the click of the lock. The door swung open, and standing in the doorway was Mrs. Jenkins, her smile cold and predatory. "Did you enjoy the game, Sarah?" she asked, her voice like velvet. Sarah felt her stomach churn, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. What have you done? What are you doing with these children?" Mrs. Jenkins' smile only widened. "I've done what needs to be done. I keep them safe. I keep them with me." The words struck Sarah like a bolt of lightning. "Safe? You're keeping them here." Her voice was barely a whisper. "They're dead, aren't they? You've killed them, and now you're using their bodies." Mrs. Jenkins didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her eyes glinting with something sinister. "They're not dead, Sarah. Not really. They are mine. All of them. They always return. And now, you will help me make sure they stay." Sarah recoiled, her mind spinning. She didn't know what Mrs. Jenkins meant, what she was truly capable of, but the evidence in front of her was clear. The missing children, the mutilated dolls, the twisted games, it was all part of something monstrous, something that Sarah could no longer ignore. "I'll never help you," Sarah spat, backing away. "I'll never be a part of this." "Oh, you already are," Mrs. Jenkins said with a chuckle, her eyes flashing. "You've been chosen, Sarah. The games have begun, and there's no turning back." Sarah turned and bolted for the stairs, her feet pounding the cold concrete. But before she could reach the top, she heard the sound of Mrs. Jenkins' voice, low and mocking. "You'll see, you all see." Sarah didn't stop running until she reached Timmy's room. Her heart was hammering in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She slammed the door shut behind her, locking it as quickly as she could. Timmy sat up in bed, startled by her frantic movements. "Mom, what's wrong?" Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and adrenaline. She had to get out now. Mrs. Jenkins was gone, but that didn't mean she was safe. She didn't know what Mrs. Jenkins had planned, but she couldn't take any chances. "Timmy, we need to leave, right now. Do you understand me?" she said, her voice sharp with urgency. Timmy nodded, fear flashing across his face. He didn't ask questions, he never did when his mother was scared. Sarah quickly gathered his things, throwing a few clothes into a bag. She was trying to remain calm, but it was getting harder to hold herself together. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Sarah froze, her blood running cold. She hadn't heard Mrs. Jenkins approach. The knock came again, this time louder, more forceful. "Sarah," Mrs. Jenkins called through the door, her voice smooth, almost sing-song. "It's time for you to come downstairs. I've been very patient with you. Don't make me come in there." The cold dread that Sarah had been suppressing washed over her again. Mrs. Jenkins was playing some kind of twisted game, and Sarah had no idea what the rules were, but she was certain they were dangerous. "Mommy, I'm scared," Timmy whispered, clutching his bear to his chest. Sarah's heart broke at the sight of his fear. She couldn't let this woman, this monster, get her hands on him. Not now, not ever. "Don't worry, baby. We're going to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her throat. She glanced around the room, her mind racing for an escape route. The windows were too high to climb out of, and the front door was likely locked. The only way out was through the basement, but she couldn't go back there, not with Mrs. Jenkins and her twisted games waiting. There had to be another way. Timmy looked at her, his wide eyes full of trust. "Mommy, are we going to go home?" Sarah nodded, though she didn't know if they'd ever be able to go back to their old life. But she couldn't focus on that now. The only thing that mattered was getting out of this nightmare. As she turned toward the door, she heard Mrs. Jenkins' voice again, this time softer, almost coaxing. "You're only making things harder for yourself. Sarah, don't make me come in there. The children are waiting. The game will be much more fun if you play along." The air felt thick with tension as Sarah inched toward the window. She wasn't sure how she was going to get out, but she knew they couldn't stay in this house another minute. Mrs. Jenkins would never let them leave. Not alive, at least. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It wasn't just about escaping, it was about surviving. There was a sudden crash downstairs, followed by the sound of muffled shouting. Sarah's blood froze. The house was alive with noise now, the stillness broken by the sound of frantic footsteps, the echo of something or someone moving quickly through the halls. "Mom," Timmy whispered, his small voice trembling. "I know, sweetheart. I know," Sarah said, trying to sound calm, but she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She crept to the door, holding her breath as she pressed her ear against it. The footsteps were getting closer. It was Mrs. Jenkins, She was coming for them. Sarah's mind raced, her pulse quickening. She had to think fast. There was no time to waste. Her eyes landed on the small window above the bed. It was a tight fit, but if she could just get Timmy through first, she might be able to follow. She ran to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtains. "Timmy, I need you to climb out the window. Go, now." Timmy's eyes widened in fear, but he didn't question her. He climbed onto the bed, and then up onto the windowsill. Sarah helped him through, watching as he disappeared out of sight, his small form disappearing into the darkness. "Good boy," Sarah whispered to herself, then turned her attention back to the door. She could hear Mrs. Jenkins' voice again, louder now, closer. "Sarah, the children need you. We all need you." Sarah backed away from the door, her hands shaking as she hurried to the window. The ground was at least 6 feet below, but she had no choice. She couldn't risk being caught. As she climbed out of the window and dropped to the ground, the sharp pain of hitting the earth jolted through her body. She gritted her teeth and immediately looked around, but the garden was empty. There was no sign of Timmy. "Timmy," she called out, panic rising in her chest. Her voice broke the stillness of the night, and just as she was about to call out again, a hand clamped over her mouth, yanking her backward. She struggled, but the grip was firm, and it dragged her into the shadows. "Quiet now," a voice hissed in her ear. "You don't want to make any more noise." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the voice, Mrs. Jenkins. Sarah's mind raced as she struggled against the cold hand gripping her mouth. She couldn't scream. She couldn't even breathe properly. Her pulse hammered in her ears and panic surged through her body. She had almost made it out, almost. But now she was back inside, and the oppressive darkness of the house felt like it was swallowing her whole. Mrs. Jenkins, silent as a predator, dragged her through the overgrown garden and toward the back door. Sarah's feet stumbled over the uneven ground as she fought to break free, but Mrs. Jenkins' grip was unyielding, her strength terrifying for a woman of her age. "Let go of me," Sarah managed to whisper fiercely, her voice muffled by the pressure on her mouth. Mrs. Jenkins' lips curled into a cold, almost pitying smile. "You can't escape, dear, not now. The children, they've already played their part. And you, Sarah, are the final piece of the puzzle." Her words sent a cold chill through Sarah's veins. She felt the weight of what she had already discovered crashing down on her. The twisted game, the mutilated dolls, the children who were no longer children. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't keeping them alive, she was preserving them, playing some twisted game with their bodies. With a force that shocked Sarah, Mrs. Jenkins shoved her through the back door and into the dimly lit hallway. The air inside was heavy with an unpleasant, musty smell, thick with mildew and decay. It seemed to cling to Sarah's skin, making her feel suffocated. "Where's Timmy?" Sarah demanded, trying to free herself from Mrs. Jenkins' grasp. "Where's my son? What have you done to him?" "Timmy," Mrs. Jenkins repeated, her voice lilting in amusement. "Oh, he's just fine. He's with the others now, just like you'll be soon. You're all part of this family. It's only fitting, don't you think?" "No," Sarah screamed, her voice breaking as she shoved away from Mrs. Jenkins. She had to find Timmy. She couldn't let Mrs. Jenkins have him. "I won't let you take him. I won't let you do this." Mrs. Jenkins grabbed Sarah by the arm again, this time with force, and jerked her toward the stairs. "You can't stop what's already been set in motion. It's too late." They reached the basement door, and as Mrs. Jenkins pushed it open, a rush of cold air hit Sarah's face. She recoiled, but Mrs. Jenkins' hand was like iron on her arm, dragging her down the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she looked around the basement. It was worse than she had imagined. The walls were lined with shelves, each shelf filled with old jars, some small, some large, each containing something twisted. Some held strange, misshapen dolls, others pieces of clothing, and some held body parts, preserved in liquid that made Sarah's stomach lurch. Her eyes darted around the room, her breath quickening. In the corner, there were cages, some were empty, Others held things Sarah could barely comprehend. Tiny, lifeless forms huddled in the corners, their bodies stiff and lifeless. The children, they're not dead, you see, Mrs. Jenkins whispered, almost lovingly, as she walked over to one of the cages. She pulled the bars apart, revealing a small, emaciated girl. They just need time to come back to life. Sarah's stomach heaved as she looked at the child. The girl's face was a pale mask, hollowed eyes staring back at Sarah, devoid of any recognition, any life. I don't understand, Sarah gasped, her voice hoarse. What is this? Why are you doing this to them? Mrs. Jenkins turned, her expression eerily serene. It's simple, really. I love them. They're mine. I take care of them. They need me. But this isn't care. This is madness. Sarah's voice trembled, the raw terror threatening to break through her composure. You've turned them into ... monsters. Mrs. Jenkins smiled faintly. Monsters? No, they're my children. And you're going to be one of them too. You'll see, Sarah. You'll understand. It's all part of the family. Her words were like poison, sinking into Sarah's mind, making her feel sick to her core. She glanced over her shoulder at the cages, the jars, and then, in the far corner, she saw a small figure, Timmy. He was sitting in a corner, looking confused but not frightened, as though he had been conditioned to accept whatever was happening. His face was pale, his clothes ragged, and he seemed so far removed from the little boy she had known. Timmy, Sarah cried, rushing toward him. But Mrs. Jenkins' hand shot out and grabbed her by the arm again, pulling her back. He's not yours to take anymore, Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice cold and final. He's mine now. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she struggled against Mrs. Jenkins' grip, her heart breaking at the sight of her son sitting so motionless. She had to save him, but how? You see, Sarah, I've been doing this for a long time, Mrs. Jenkins continued almost wistfully. I find them, I take care of them, I keep them with me, and now you'll join them. She motioned to the shelves, to the jars and dolls, and Sarah understood then. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just keeping the children. She was turning them into something else, something unnatural, something twisted. Sarah's eyes darted to the far corner, where there was a heavy curtain that led to another room. It was her only chance. With a burst of strength, Sarah pulled away from Mrs. Jenkins and bolted toward the curtain. But before she could reach it, Mrs. Jenkins was on her again, her hands gripping Sarah's shoulders with an unnatural force. Don't think you can escape now, Sarah, Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice low and threatening. The game is over. You're already one of us. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in sharp gasps as Mrs. Jenkins tightened her grip on her shoulders. The woman's fingers dug into Sarah's skin like claws, cold and unrelenting. Desperation clawed at Sarah's insides, urging her to break free, but she was trapped, surrounded by the horrors of the basement. Mrs. Jenkins' laugh echoed through the room, dark and hollow. You really think you can escape me? You think you're the first to try? Sarah's mind was racing, trying to find any opening, any chance to get to Timmy and run. But every exit, every possibility seemed impossible. The basement was a maze of twisted remnants of the past, full of things too horrifying to comprehend. The children in the cages, the jars filled with disturbing artifacts. Sarah had become one more part of this nightmare. But Mrs. Jenkins wasn't finished. You think you know what's happening here, don't you? Mrs. Jenkins whispered, her voice slipping into a low, almost nostalgic tone. You think you understand what I've done, but you don't know the whole story. Sarah's eyes narrowed, and she yanked her arm from Mrs. Jenkins' grip, taking a small step back. Tell me then, what's the story? What have you done to these children? Mrs. Jenkins' smile twisted. She moved toward one of the shelves, picking up an old withered photo album. She flipped through it slowly, her fingers brushing over the yellowed pages as though each one was a precious memory. These children, Mrs. Jenkins began, her voice taking on a strange tenderness. They aren't the first. They never are. This house has seen many, many generations, and I've always cared for them, brought them into my care, kept them safe, all of them." Her voice turned darker. "You see, I learned long ago that children are the most precious thing in this world. They're fragile, so easy to break, but I found a way to keep them from growing up and leaving me. I found a way to make them stay ... forever." Sarah shook her head, her throat tight with disbelief. This is insane. You're talking about keeping children trapped, turning them into something they're not. No, Mrs. Jenkins corrected her gently, her voice almost loving now. "I'm not keeping them trapped. I'm giving them a gift, an eternal gift. And you, Sarah, you join them. You'll see, it's the only way." Sarah stumbled backward, her mind reeling. She couldn't wrap her head around it. This woman had been keeping children in some twisted form of preservation, not letting them grow or leave. She was using them in some unholy ritual, and now she wanted Sarah to be part of it. "You really don't know, do you?" Mrs. Jenkins continued, her eyes glinting with a strange, distant gleam. "You see, my family has lived here for generations. My ancestors were innovators, you could say. They discovered a way to cheat time, to keep what they love from fading away. And I, being the last of the line, perfected it." She looked over at the jars lined up on the shelves, the faces of children preserved in their twisted state. "It's all part of a process. I keep them here, I care for them. They don't age, they don't grow, and they never leave. They stay with me forever." The horror of her words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just insane, she was a monster who had carried out this twisted, macabre ritual for years. She wasn't merely a caretaker, she was a keeper of souls, trapped in bodies that never aged. "But the cost," Mrs. Jenkins said, almost wistfully, "is that they must never leave. They must never change. And when one of them goes, I need to replace them. That's where you come in." Sarah's mind swam as the reality of Mrs. Jenkins' twisted world slowly sank in. She wasn't just a babysitter. She was part of a grotesque cycle, a sacrifice to keep Mrs. Jenkins' madness alive. "I don't understand," Sarah gasped, barely able to breathe. "What do you mean by replacing them?" Mrs. Jenkins didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for a jar on the top shelf, and Sarah recoiled in horror as Mrs. Jenkins opened it to reveal a tiny, preserved hand, its skin pale and yellowed, lying in the murky liquid. "I told you, Sarah, I keep them here forever. And when one of them is lost, I simply have to find another, a fresh soul to keep the game going." Her eyes narrowed with a predatory glint. "And now, my dear, you are the one to replace the last piece. You'll join them." Fear surged in Sarah's chest like a tidal wave, and she couldn't hold back the desperate sob that tore through her. No, I won't. You can't do this to me." Mrs. Jenkins only smiled, her lips curling into a knowing, dark grin. "Oh, but I already have, Sarah. The game is already in motion, and you're already part of it. There's no going back now." Sarah's heart pounded as she backed away from Mrs. Jenkins, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't breathe. The weight of Mrs. Jenkins' twisted words was crushing her, pressing down on her chest like an iron fist. "I won't let you do this," Sarah cried, the words almost choking her. Mrs. Jenkins tilted her head to the side, her smile wide and unsettling. "You don't have a choice, Sarah. You never did." The woman stepped forward, her pace deliberate, her eyes never leaving Sarah's. It was as if she was savoring every moment of Sarah's fear, like a predator toying with its prey before the final strike. Sarah's mind raced, but there was no plan, no way out. The basement seemed to grow colder, the walls closing in, making it harder to think. Timmy was still in the corner, his face a blank mask of confusion, and Sarah felt her heart break all over again. "Timmy," she shouted, desperate. "Timmy, come to me, please." Timmy blinked and looked at her, but he didn't move. It was as if he couldn't hear her or didn't recognize her voice. Mrs. Jenkins' smile twisted even further as she placed a hand on Sarah's arm. "He's already mine, Sarah, don't you see? The children here never truly leave, not once they've been brought into the fold. You're just as much a part of it now as they are." "No," Sarah screamed, shaking off Mrs. Jenkins' grip. She had to move. She had to act. With a burst of adrenaline, she spun toward the heavy curtain at the far end of the basement. She couldn't let herself be taken. She had to protect Timmy, no matter the cost. But as she ran toward the curtain, Mrs. Jenkins was faster. She darted in front of Sarah, blocking her way. "You can't escape me, Sarah," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, her voice laced with mock pity. "You'll learn. You'll join us, like the others." The finality in her words froze Sarah in her tracks. She knew deep down that she couldn't keep running. Mrs. Jenkins was right. She was already trapped. There was no getting out, no way to escape. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up just yet. With a sudden surge of defiance, she grabbed a nearby metal rod that had been left discarded on the ground. A leftover piece of something that had once been used in the house's many repairs. She swung it at Mrs. Jenkins, the weight of it catching her off guard. Mrs. Jenkins staggered back, surprised but not hurt. The look of amusement faded from her face for just a moment, replaced by a flicker of something darker. "You really think you can fight me?" Mrs. Jenkins sneered. "You're just like the others, weak, desperate. You can't save him, Sarah. He's already mine." "No," Sarah's voice was shaking but firm. "I won't let you turn him into one of your puppets." With all the strength she could muster, Sarah lunged forward, slamming the rod into Mrs. Jenkins' chest. For a brief moment, Sarah thought she saw something change in Mrs. Jenkins' eyes, something almost human, something that made her doubt the woman's unnaturalness. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a twisted, horrifying smile. "You really are trying, aren't you?" Mrs. Jenkins said softly, almost admiringly. "But you're playing a game you can't win." Sarah's mind was racing, but she kept her focus on Timmy. If she didn't stop Mrs. Jenkins now, there was no hope. There had to be something she could do. Without thinking, she swung the metal rod again, this time striking Mrs. Jenkins across the face. The force of the blow knocked the woman backward, but she didn't fall. Her head snapped back into place, and she laughed a low, cold, unhinged laugh. "You think you can kill me? I'm already dead, Sarah. And so are you. In time, you'll understand. You'll see it, just like the others." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. What was she supposed to do? How could she fight someone who was already dead? Someone who had lived for generations, trapping children in this twisted house of horrors. But then, just as Sarah felt herself sinking into hopelessness, a thought sparked in her mind. The children, the basement, they were the key. Without a second thought, Sarah turned toward the cages where the children were still held. Her pulse raced as she pulled the bars of one open, freeing one of the girls who was barely conscious. "Help me, please. You have to help us," Sarah begged, her voice raw. The girl's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Sarah thought she might respond. But instead, the girl just stared at her, expressionless, before turning toward Mrs. Jenkins. "I'm sorry," the girl said, her voice hollow. "We can't help you. We're already gone." The despair in the girl's voice broke Sarah's heart. There was no saving them. There was no way to undo what Mrs. Jenkins had done. The children weren't alive, not in the way Sarah had hoped. They were like vessels, trapped in a limbo. And the only way to escape was to break the cycle, to stop Mrs. Jenkins. Sarah's head spun. There had to be a way. She couldn't let herself lose hope. She couldn't fail Timmy. "Please," Sarah screamed again. But it was no use. The children in the cages were all lost. They had given up. They were part of the cycle now, just as Mrs. Jenkins had wanted. The basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening thud. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, her body shaking from the exertion and terror. The cold stone walls of the basement closed in around her, and the only light came from the flickering bulbs overhead. Mrs. Jenkins was still standing in front of her, as unnervingly composed as ever. Her twisted smile never wavered. For a brief moment, Sarah thought she might just break. She had fought. She had tried to save Timmy. But Mrs. Jenkins was too powerful. The house, this nightmare, had its claws deep inside her. Her thoughts flashed to Timmy, to the lifeless children in the cages, and to the life they had all lost in this house of horrors. But then, in the darkest corner of her mind, a spark of determination flared. She could still fight. She had to. "You're not going to win," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse, but unwavering. "You may think you control everything, but you don't. You've made your life a twisted game, and you're not going to take us." Mrs. Jenkins' smile wavered, her lips pulling back into a tight, thin line. She stepped forward, her voice growing colder. "You don't get it, do you? There's no escape. You're part of this now. You'll never leave this house. You'll never leave me." "I'll leave," Sarah said, her voice growing firmer. "I'll take my son, and I'll walk out of this nightmare. You can't keep us here." For the first time since they had entered the basement, Mrs. Jenkins' eyes flickered with something resembling uncertainty. But before Sarah could act on the moment of doubt, the house seemed to shift. Shadows stretched longer, and the air grew heavier, as if the house itself was pushing back against her. "I won't let you," Mrs. Jenkins hissed, her voice low and dangerous. Her face twisted into something grotesque, and Sarah saw the darkness lurking behind the facade of the woman who had once seemed so kind. In that instant, everything fell away: the house, the basement, the haunting presence of Mrs. Jenkins. Sarah knew what she had to do. She reached out, her hands trembling, and grabbed hold of the nearest shelf. With a force fueled by desperation, she pulled a large, heavy jar from the shelf and hurled it at Mrs. Jenkins. The jar shattered against the wall, its contents splattering onto the floor. The sound was deafening, the glass breaking as Mrs. Jenkins flinched, her hands flying up in an instinctive attempt to shield herself. For a split second, Sarah saw something unexpected: vulnerability. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't as invincible as she had seemed. She wasn't untouchable. "Now," Sarah screamed, turning her head toward Timmy, who was still sitting in the corner, wide-eyed and motionless. "Timmy, now, come with me." Timmy's head jerked up at the sound of her voice. Something in his gaze had changed, his eyes no longer distant and vacant. The hold Mrs. Jenkins had over him was slipping. Without a word, Timmy stood and stumbled toward his mother, his small legs unsteady but determined. It was as if Sarah's call had broken the spell, and he was no longer trapped in the fog of Mrs. Jenkins' influence. "Come on, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice trembling with relief as she reached out to him. "We're getting out of here." As Sarah took Timmy's hand and turned toward the door, the house seemed to fight back one last time. The walls groaned and the ground beneath their feet shook, as if the very foundations of the place were resisting their escape. But Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't. She ran, pulling Timmy with her, moving faster than she thought possible. "Sarah!" Mrs. Jenkins' voice rang out from behind them, shrill and panicked. "You can't leave me. You belong here." Sarah's heart pounded, but she didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. They had to get out, away from this madness, away from the nightmare that had held them captive for so long. They reached the front door, and Sarah's hand shook as she grabbed the doorknob. She yanked it open, and the cool night air rushed in like a breath of freedom. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her heart racing. She turned to look at Timmy, her eyes filled with hope. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "We're free." But just as she stepped forward, Mrs. Jenkins' voice cut through the night. "You'll never escape me, Sarah. I'll always find you. You're mine." Sarah's grip on Timmy tightened. They weren't safe yet, but as they stepped into the cold, empty night, Sarah knew one thing for certain. She would fight to her last breath to protect Timmy. She wouldn't let this house claim them. Not now, not ever. The days that followed were a blur of motion, running, hiding, trying to put the pieces of their lives back together. Sarah and Timmy moved far away from the house, settling in a small town where they could start anew. But the memories of that dark place never fully left Sarah. The nightmares haunted her, and every shadow seemed to carry the echo of Mrs. Jenkins' voice. She couldn't forget, she couldn't undo what had been done, but she would never stop fighting. She would protect Timmy, and she would keep him safe. And if Mrs. Jenkins ever tried to find them again, she would be ready. Sarah knew one thing for sure: the darkness would never fully consume her. She would be the light in Timmy's world, and that was all that mattered.